the Tawheed and the completion of it. We're supposed to complete our Tawheed. We're supposed to perfect our Tawheed. There's no such a thing that it's permissible to have, half and half Tawheed. It has to be fully perfect. So following the desires in what Allah forbade, that means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade something, so a person would follow his desire to approve it or to follow in it, or when it comes to acts of obedience to Allah, that makes the person not fulfilling the perfect Tawheed. Does not make him a disbeliever, but it weakens his Tawheed. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, many of the sins that the origin of it is following the desires is called kufr or shirk. Like for example, كقتال المسلم, fighting a Muslim. ومن أتى حائضا أو امرأة في دبرها, or if a man would have relations with his wife from the dubur, which is from other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the zar', or where the child is born. وَمَنْ شَرِبَ الْخَمْرَ فِي الْمَرَّةِ الرَّابِعَةِ, and whoever drink wine or intoxications in the fourth time till he becomes addicted to it. And the hadith that came in this subject, which basically the word of kufr or shirk is mentioned. قتال Muslim, kufr. So this is an act of disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or through the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the word kufr is mentioned. And he says, وَإِن كَانَ ذَلِكَ لَا يُخْرِجُ عَنِ الْمِلَّةِ بِالْكُلِّيَّةِ. Committing these major sins does not take the person outside the fold of Islam, does not make him a disbeliever. But the word kufr is mentioned, the word disbelief is mentioned, and that's why قال السلف, the early generations of Islam, they said كفر دون كفر وشرك دون شرك. It's kufr, but it's in a lesser level than the major kufr. It's shirk, but on a lesser level than the major shirk that takes the person outside the fold of Islam. And as we all should agree upon, that we need to follow the deen that was established at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba, and as-Salaf as-Salih, the rightly guided predecessors, the early generations of Islam. And the more we read the work of these people, like one of them is Ibn Rajab rahimahullah, when he talked even about the terminologies that as-Salaf used, the early generations of Islam, they used certain terminologies that we use today, but they understood it, or they used it in such a way that we should use it also in the same manner, and not just to follow the linguistics of it, because this is religious terms. So, and this is where it protects the person from falling into this extremism by just referring to the wahy, reading Quran, reading a hadith, and they start making their own rulings. But how did they understood these hadith that talks about certain actions as being kufr? It's not the same kufr that takes the person outside the fold of Islam. Because this is how the entire wahy, revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be understood. And that's not to belittle the evil sins, but to put things in the right perspective. So going back again still to following the desires. Following the desires in a sinful way, not following the desire. Everybody has a desire, everybody wants to follow their desire. But as long as it's permissible and not in a sinful way. And he says, وَقَدْ وَرَدَ إِطْلَاقُ الْإِلَهِ عَلَى الْهَوَى الْمُتَّبَعِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the word ilah with regards to those who follow their desires. They worship or they make their desires as ilah. They make their desires as the one to be worshipped. As the ayah in Surah Al-Furqan, أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَى. Have you seen the one that took his ilah as to be his desire? His desire is his ilah. Nobody worship his desire in the sense that he makes sujood to his desire and believe that his desire is the creator, the sustainer. So how did they worship their desires? This is the meaning that he mentioned earlier about the word ilah. Al-ilah الذي يطاع فلا يعصى إجلالا ومحبة وتوكلا وخوفا ورجاء. Al-ilah is the one to be worshipped, and al-ilah is the one to be obeyed and not to be disobeyed, with perfect love, with fear, with hope, with relying. This is the meaning of al-ilah. So the ayah then, as Al-Hasan al-Basri rahimahullah, he said, هو الذي لا يهوى شيئا إلا ركبه. The one that takes his desire as ilah is the one that every time he desires something, he rakibah, that means ride over it. That means he follows it. Like as if he's riding his desire, and his desire is taking him everywhere. His desire is what moves him, not the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So every time he desires something, he follows his desire. So where is then the ilah in his life? When the ilah is not the one to be obeyed in his life, it's his desire is the one that is being obeyed in his life. And still also that doesn't make the person a disbeliever. But you see how the meaning of al-ilah, to establish the meaning of la ilaha illallah, is to establish this perfect meaning of it, and that is to also follow the commands of Allah. وَقَالَ قَتَادَةً. In the tafsir of the ayat, we also refer to the early generations of al-Islam. Rajab rahimahullah has a beautiful, also not a big of a book, something small, but great in value. And the title of it, فضل علم السلف على علم الخلف. The superiority of the knowledge of Salaf, the early generations of Islam, versus the knowledge of Al-Khalaf, those who came later. And this is, if we perfect this meaning, by the will of Allah, we will be protected from all of this mess that is happening to many of the Muslims in many communities. Why? Because the Khalaf, the later generations, are the ones that are being followed. And everyone has their own understanding, and regardless of the sincerity, we're not questioning what's in the hearts of the people, but they look at the reality that they're in, or the environment that they're in, or the 21st century, or the West versus the East, whatever there is. And then the deen becomes according to how their life is, and to make sure that they secure this worldly gains in this life. This is the understanding, or many distorted things. And that's why we have to refer back always to what the early generations of Islam said. So Al-Hasan al-Basri, this is what he said about the ayah. Qatada, he said, هو الذي كلما هوى شيئا ركبه. Same statement. أرأيت الذي أرأيت من اتخذ إله هواه. Did you see the one that took his desire as his ilah? Is the one that every time he desires something, he rides on it, he follows it. وكلما اشتهى شيئا أتاه. And every time he desires something, he go gets it. This is sounds like the normal thing of human beings, what they do nowadays, right? You desire something, you go get it. And if people don't get what they desire because they don't have the means to it. But say that if they have the means to it, they have the physical means, they have the wealth, they have everything, and they desire something, nothing will stop them for the most part if they have the means. But that's not religion. This is just following one's desire as if a person is worshipping his desire. لا يحجزه عن ذلك ورع ولا تقوى. Nothing prevents him from following his desire from wara' or taqwa. Wara', to leave something out of the fear that this can harm him in the hereafter. To leave something because of the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if a person leaves something because of some fear of this worldly life, that means it's not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from him. Because some people, they leave what their desires so that they have a healthy body, for example. Right? They don't eat certain things, they don't drink certain things because they want to maintain their health. That's not for the sake of Allah. So it's to be done and to leave things for the sake of Allah, because of the taqwa of Allah, because of la ilaha illallah. And that's why ibadatullah, to worship Allah with ijlal, with ta'zeem, to exalt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the reason why you're not drinking wine is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade you from it. Not because it smells bad or tastes bad or it's not good for your health and all of these types of things that people try to find excuses for themselves. No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade us from it. That's what la ilaha illallah means and entails. And this is the entire life is about this. And the more we talk about the wisdom behind things, the more we belittle the effect of la ilaha illallah, and we don't call people to the deen of al-Islam. We're just calling people to a lifestyle. We're not calling people to a lifestyle. Of course, it's the perfect lifestyle. We're calling people to the tawheed, to the oneness of worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the purpose of this life. Everything is related to la ilaha illallah. And then he says, وَرُوِيَ عن من حديث أبي أمامة مرفوعا بإسناد ضعيف. Hadith that is weak, not authentic. Why he mentions it? Because of a meaning that he wants to convey. He said, ما تحت ظل السماء إله يعبد أعظم عند الله من هوى متبع. which means there's nothing under the shade of the heavens. That means there's nothing on the face of earth that is to be worshipped greater to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than a desire that is being followed. That means the worst thing that people worship in this life is their desires. They follow their desires, which goes into the meaning of what the verse said. And this is basically also the root of worshipping other than Allah. It's a desire that people had, so they would invent their own belief and they would invent their own creed. It's because of their desire. Desire doesn't have to be the sinful desires like al-fawahish or zina or something like this. Desire can be a religious desire. Someone that desires something religiously. Or even someone would forbid something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permitted. It's a desire. So for those, for example, forbid permissible food, or they want to live a very tough life or abstain from the beauty of this life, if it's not according to the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, it's following their desire. So it doesn't matter what kind of a desire it is if it's not according to the deen of Islam. وفي حديث آخر, in another narration, and also it's a weak one, لا تزال لا إله إلا الله تدفع عن أصحابها حتى يؤثروا دنياهم على دينهم فإذا فعلوا ذلك ردت عليهم وقيل لهم كذبتم. Something more or less of the meaning that La ilaha illallah will keep on being pushed away from its the one that would say it till they would choose this dunya over their religion. And if they do that, it will be rejected on them and it will say to them, you lied. Basically, it means La ilaha illallah. When a person says La ilaha illallah, he will be tested with regards to following your desire or following the commands of Allah. And the desire is the immediate one for the worldly gain versus what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. And it's not always that you have to abstain from the desires of this dunya. Actually, if you follow the commands of Allah, you'll have the best of this life and the hereafter. ويشهد لذلك الحديث الصحيح. Now he mentioned an authentic hadith from the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام that he said, تعس عبد الدينار, تعس عبد الدرهم, تعس عبد القطيفة, تعس عبد الخميصة, تعس وانتكس وإذا شيك فلن تقش. And the hadith is to be continued. But here he mentioned part of it. تعس, that means he is ruined, he is miserable, he's in a bad state. Who is that person? Abdul Dinar, the slave of a dinar. Dinar is the money. تعس عبد الدرهم. A dirham also is the money. Dinar is bigger than the dirham. So like a dollar versus a penny. He is ta'is. Whether this is a dua against him, that this how he's going to be, or this is a reality that this is, and both outcome is the same. So he is ruined, he is miserable, the one that is the slave of the money. تعس عبد القطيفة. The same thing is repeated for the slave of al-qatifa. Al-qatifa is a special type of cloth that is thick. تعس عبد الخميصة. Al-khamisa is another piece of cloth. Different types of wealth. It doesn't have to be just the cash money. Some people are enslaved to other forms of wealth. تعس وانتكس. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, تعس is miserable, he's ruined. وانتكس, that means he's inverted. He is upside down. And the word intakas, that means we're supposed to be upright. And when a person is upright, that means he's going according to his fitrah. The fitrah, the pure nature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. If someone invert this, he's intakas. If someone opposes the deen of Allah, which is one step closer to ruining one's nature and pure nature, so this is intikasa, whether it's to go back or to be inverted, and it's all the same outcome. وَإِذَا شِيكَ فَلَنْ تَقَشْ. إِذَا شِيكَ, if he's poked with something very small, a thorn or something like this, فَلَنْ تَقَشْ, that means may it not be taken away from him. That means the smallest pain becomes magnified. Why? Because he's the slave of these materialistic things. And this life is not about being everlasting living in this world, or it's not about always happy and always enjoying and always be given things. This life for everyone, it's one day a person is given, one day he's deprived of something. So if he's enslaved to this worldly life, he will live a miserable life because he's not going to be always gaining and intoxicated by gaining and gaining. One day will come even if he reaches very old in age and he's about to die, all of that will be ruined, and this is the real regret. So all of that is because of what? Because of the desires, the sinful desire that took the person away from perfecting La ilaha illallah. And then the last part in this section, he says, فَدَلَّ هَذَا عَلَى أَنَّ كُلَّ مَنْ أَحَبَّ شَيْئًا وَأَطَاعَ. These are, by the way, these are treasures, because we're supposed to carry it with us at all time till we end our life. It's not just to be once in a while thinking about these things. And we have a problem, and we have many problems, of course, that we're not constantly reminding ourselves with these meanings. And that's why the iman gets weaker, and it gets weaker, and nothing to make the iman and the faith stronger. And the acts of worship loses these acts that is supposed to be done by the heart. And that's why the circles of knowledge and reciting the Quran and learning the deen of Islam constantly, so that these meanings is always filling our hearts. So he says all of what's mentioned before is an evidence that anyone that loves anything and he obeys it, وَكَانَ غَايَةَ قَصْدِهِ وَمَطْلُوبِهِ, and this was his ultimate objective and the ultimate thing that he seeks, وَوَالَ لِأَجْلِهِ, and he become loyal because of that thing that he loves and what he obeys, وَعَادَ لِأَجْلِهِ, and he would have enmity and disloyal himself according to what he loves and he follows, فَهُوَ عَبْدُهُ, he is his slave. So if you want to know you are a slave of what, basically see in yourself what do you love and you obey, and this is your objective, this is what you seek, this is what you're loyal to, this is what you become enemy for. That means you are a slave to whatever you fulfill these things. And the believers, they love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the perfect love. They're obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the absolute sense, in full submission. And this is their objective, this is what they seek. They are loyal to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the commands of Allah, and they're enemies to the enemies of Allah. And this is how they are. And that's why they are slaves of Allah. They are servants of Allah. Those who are slaves and servants to other than Allah, they do the same thing, but to other than Allah. So that means, as mentioned before, there's no way out of being like this. Every single human being, they are slaves of something. So those who claim that they're free from any type of attachment or whatever, no, they're enslaved to their own desires. And this is the worst slavery that can ever exist. And they're humiliated more than anything else. Because again, there's no way out. By default, as a human being, you have to be abd. There's no way out of this. Either to be abd to Allah, or to abd to a makhluk, or your own self, which is all creation of Allah. So the real free man, if it's correct to say, is the one that he detached himself from being enslaved to any of the worldly makhluk and the creation of Allah, and to be a true abd to Allah, to be in full submission to the commands of Allah. And this is how a person, or how the subject of al-ubudiyya is mentioned. See how beautifully stated that it's the same thing for the believers and for the disbelievers. Their actions are the same, so you're not, of course, but one is worshipping Allah and one is worshipping his own self or worshipping something else. But the thing is, that makes it easy for the person to understand that if you worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're not doing anything, you're not depriving yourself from some form of a fun that the others are doing. No, it's not really the case. And if they have some immediate enjoyment that you're not having, it's going to end up the worst thing for them unless they repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what matters is what the end of things. So this is clear. Then he says, وَيَدُلُّ عَلَيْهِ أَيْضًا, also as an evidence to this, أن الله تعالى سمى طاعة الشيطان في معصيته عبادة للشيطان. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called the obedience of the shaitan, Iblis, the devil, in the disobedience of Allah, he called it the worship of shaitan. So some people worship shaitan, even though they don't make sujood to the shaitan necessarily, but just for the fact that they're obedient to the shaitan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called them, they are worshippers of shaitan. As he said subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Yasin, أَلَمْ أَعَدْ إِلَيْكُمْ يَا بَنِي آدَمَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا الشَّيْطَانِ إِنَّهُ لَكُمْ عَدُوٌّ مُبِينٌ. Didn't I entrust you and took the covenant from you, O sons of Adam? And this will be said to the people on the day of judgment, that you do not worship shaitan. Indeed, he is a clear enemy to you. And this is to the disbelievers and for those who obey the shaitan, not necessarily worshipped him the way we think of ibadah as far as the rituals are concerned, because of their obedience to the shaitan. وقال حكيا عن خليله إبراهيم عليه السلام. And also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he said to his father, يا أبت لا تعبد الشيطان إن الشيطان كان للرحمن عصيا. O my father, do not worship the shaitan. Indeed, the shaitan was to Ar-Rahman, to the most beneficent, the most merciful, disobedient. He was disobedient. He's disobedient to Allah. So don't worship the shaitan. And his father, he would make statues and images of these gods that they worship besides Allah, and they would worship it, and they don't call it shaitan. And that's why anyone that worship other than Allah, in reality, they're worshiping shaitan. So if they claim that they're worshiping a prophet of Allah, like Isa alayhi salam, for example, they're in reality worshiping the shaitan, because the shaitan is the one that deceived them to worship other than Allah. And Isa alayhi salam, he disloyal himself from such an evil act. They're not exalting him, they're not respecting him, they are worshipping shaitan, because the shaitan is the one that led them to worship other than Allah. So therefore, فَمَنْ لَمْ يُحَقِّقْ عُبُودِيَّةَ الرَّحْمَنِ وَطَاعَتَهُ, whoever does not establish the ubudiyyah, the servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most merciful, and being obedient to him, فَإِنَّهُ يَعْبُدُ الشَّيْطَانَ بِطَاعَتِهِ لَهُ, then he is indeed worshipping the shaitan by being obedient to him. It's as clear as this. This is how things should be clear, and this is how the Quran makes the matter very clear. Whoever does not establish the ubudiyyah to Allah, he is worshipping the shaitan. And not everybody in the same level. So whoever is not establishing the worship of Allah in the perfect sense, there's something missing. That missing part is, instead, he's worshipping the shaitan, but not as major as someone else that would do more. So sins versus disbelief. So it's always either or. If he's not in the state of obedience to Allah, he is in state of obeying the shaitan. وَلَمْ يَخْلُصْ مِنْ عِبَادَةِ الشَّيْطَانِ إِلَّا مَنْ أَخْلَصَ عُبُودِيَّةَ الرَّحْمَنِ. And this is the meaning that he's saying. And he did not purify himself from the worship of the shaitan, except the one that purified his worship of Allah ar-Rahman. So al-Ikhlas has to be attained. It's not an optional thing. And al-Ikhlas means purely, sincerely, without any traces of impurities. When they say akhlas al-laban, when the milk is purified, so there's no impurities in it. So whoever his ibadah is not purely to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so there's some contaminations in it. This contamination means what? There's some worship of the shaitan is being done. Not necessarily in the state of disbelief. Can be in the categories of sins. وَهُمُ الَّذِينَ قَالَ اللَّهُ فِيهِمْ, and they are the people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about them, إِنَّ عِبَادِي لَيْسَ لَكَ عَلَيْهِمْ سُلْطَانٌ. The believers, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to the shaitan, my slaves, my servants, you have no authority over them. Who are the servants of Allah? Who are the ibad of Allah? They are the ones that established La ilaha illallah and purely, sincerely said it in such meaning that we heard. فَهُمُ الَّذِينَ حَقَّقُوا قَوْلَ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ وَأَخْلَصُوا فِي قَوْلِهَا. And that's why, because it's very obvious. Some people, they say La ilaha illallah, but the shaitan have authority over them. And they follow the ways of the shaitan in the categories of sins. So that means they did not establish La ilaha illallah in the perfect sense. They have it, they're believers, they're Muslims and so on, but they did not establish it in the perfect way. Why? Because they allow shaitan to have authority over them by disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, وَأَخْلَصُوا فِي قَوْلِهَا وَصَدَّقُوا قَوْلَهُمْ بِفِعْلِهِمْ. They said it sincerely, and they made their actions to fit with truthfulness with their speech. Speech and actions are on the same pace. So when they say La ilaha illallah, that means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one worshipped. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to be obeyed with love and fear and so on. So they acted upon what they said. They acted upon that belief by making sure that they are submitting themselves to the commands of Allah. فَلَمْ يَلْتَفِتُوا إِلَى غَيْرِ اللَّهِ. They did not turn to other than Allah. مَحَبَّةً وَرَجَاءً وَخَشْيَةً وَطَاعَةً وَتَوَكُّلًا. He repeats The same actions done by the heart. They did not turn to other than Allah with this love and hope and fear and obedience and a tawakkul. All of these things are purely, sincerely to be done to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and they never turn to other than Allah with these things. These mahabba that makes a person disobey Allah also. وهم الذين صدقوا في قول لا إله إلا الله وهم عباد الله حقا. They are the ones that truthfully said لا إله إلا الله, and they are the true servants of Allah. Clear? So therefore, فأما من قال لا إله إلا الله بلسانه. Therefore, whoever says لا إله إلا الله with his tongue, he says it. ثم أطاع الشيطان وهواه. Then he obeyed the shaitan and his desire. في معصية الله, in the sinful way, in disobeying Allah. ومخالفته, and opposing the commands of Allah. فقد كذب فعله قوله. That means his actions belied his speech. When he said لا إله إلا الله, what is the meaning of لا إله إلا الله again? There's no one worthy of worship except Allah, and He's the one to be obeyed with ijlal, with exaltation, with love, with fear, with hope, with tawakkul. Right? So if he says La ilaha illallah, but then he obeys the shaitan and his desire, that means his actions is belying his speech. Is not according to what he said in his speech. But if it's only in the category of sins disobeying Allah, that means it decreases. وَنَقَصَ مِنْ كَمَالِ تَوْحِيدِهِ بِقَدْرِ مَعْصِيَةِ اللَّهِ فِي طَاعَةِ الشَّيْطَانِ وَالْهَوَى. So the perfection of his tawheed becomes less deficient, not completely wiped away, but it becomes weak and less according to how much is the sin that made him obeys the shaitan and disobey Allah. So it's always the struggle in this life to perfect the tawheed, and therefore zero obedience to the shaitan. Then again, the sins, a person slips away in obeying the desires and the shaitan. So there's a weakness in the tawheed. He fills it immediately with repenting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If he doesn't repent to Allah, then it's weakening the tawheed and giving more strength to the obedience of shaitan and the desire. And this is according to the level and the amount of the sin. وَمَنْ أَضَلُّ مِمَّنِ اتَّبَعَ هَوَاهُ بِغَيْرِ هُدًى مِّنَ اللَّهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in Surah Al-Qasas, verse number 50, there is no one more deviant than someone that followed his desire without guidance from Allah. That means he's the worst deviant, the one that follows his desire without guidance from Allah. And the guidance from Allah, we know that from the ilm, from the knowledge, from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in Surah Sad, verse number 26, وَلَا تَتَّبِعِ الْهَوَى فَيُضِلَّكَ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. That was given to the prophets of Allah. Do not follow your desire, otherwise it would lead you astray from the path of Allah. Very clear and straightforward. So whoever trusts himself, he's in great danger. Don't trust yourself, because we have desire mixed with all kinds of things. Put your trust in Allah and know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from you, and then seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to follow the commands of Allah. But no ilm, no knowledge, just the fact that a person loves the deen or wants to be righteous and he thinks that this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from him, what's the evidence of that? If it's without clear evidences in the Quran and the Sunnah. This deen is well established based on ilm, based on knowledge, not based on emotions. And I like this, and since I'm a righteous person, that means, I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about metaphorically, if someone believes that way, if he sees himself as someone away from sins and so on, that means he has to be saying the truth, because that's what it feels right. Where do you get that from? This deen is based on ilm, evidences, and the shaitan has his way. How many people the shaitan deviated because of the love that they have to the deen? And there's many ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and the ulama, when they even compiled books about the deviant sects, they're not all out there to try to harm the deen. They have all kinds of sincerity and akhlaq and manners and so on. But it's the desires that would take them away from following the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and the way it was understood and applied by the early generations of Islam. So then he says, and this is always the way of Ibn Rajab, he admonishes the heart after he gives these principles and these foundations of the deen. He said, فَيَا هَذَا, Ya hada, O you, talking to each and every one of us, كن عبد الله لا عبد الهوى. Be a abd to Allah. Don't be the abd of your desire. Be كن عبد الله لا عبد الهوى. فإن الهوى يهوي بصاحبه في النار. فإن الهوى, indeed الهوى, the desire, يهوي, it's the same letters. الهوى يهوي. يهوي, and this is one of the meanings that you get from the word desire. يهوي, that means when someone falls like a, what do you call the free fall. When someone falls a free fall, this is yahwi, right? So al-hawa yahwi, the desire makes the person fall like this without any control. The person that follows the desire, he would fall into the hellfire. And that's what one of the meanings of al-hawa is, because it takes the person down into the hellfire. أَأَرْبَابٌ مُتَفَرِّقُونَ خَيْرٌ أَمِ اللَّهُ الْوَاحِدُ الْقَهَّارُ. Part of the ayah in Surah Yusuf. أَرْبَابٌ مُتَفَرِّقُونَ, lords, متفرقون, when people worship other than Allah, with many different gods and things like this, better, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, al-wahid al-qahar, the only one, the one that is irresistible. تعس عبد الدرهم تعس عبد الدينار. He says again, he is ruined and he's miserable, the slave of the dirham, the slave of the dinar. He says, Wallahi. Then he says, he swears by Allah. Again, this is Ibn Rajab, rahimahullah, is saying that. والله ما ينجو غدا من عذاب الله إلا من حقق عبودية الله وحده ولم يلتفت معه إلى شيء من الأغيار. Wallahi, by Allah, he's not going to be saved tomorrow, which is in the day of judgment, from the punishment of Allah, except the one that established the ubudiyyah, the servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and did not turn away from this to any of these things that never ends and it's always changing, which is other than Allah. So this is the struggle, this is the job of one's life, is to make sure that his heart is fully, sincerely turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And every time he slips away, he perfect that with the tawheed, with the repentance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to save oneself from the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore the last statement in this part, he says, وَمَنْ عَلِمَ أَنَّ إِلَهَهُ وَمَعْبُودَهُ فَرْضٌ فَلْيُفْرِدْهُ بِالْعُبُودِيَّةِ وَلَا يُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادَةِ رَبِّ أَحَدٍ. Whoever knows that his ilah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَمَعْبُودَهُ, the one that he worship, fard, that means he's only one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only Rabb, and he's the only one to be worshipped. Therefore, what should you do? فَلْيُفْرِدْهُ بِالْعُبُودِيَّةِ, then worship him alone. If you say that he's the only one worthy of worship, then be truthful and worship him alone. And when you worship him alone, not just that you make salah to him alone, the love of Allah, the fear of Allah, the hope for the rewards from Allah, relying upon Allah, and all the different acts of worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And don't take the path of being obedient to the shaitan, obedient to your desire, the sinful desire. You think that you know what is best for you, so you would say, well, if I don't take riba loans, I will have a miserable life. MashaAllah. You know what's best for you. And you turn away from the commands of Allah. Or if I don't marry this person, I would have a miserable life. And you know that this is something that is not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from you. It's not permissible, it's something like this. So again, not to trust oneself and to put our trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that requires knowledge. And it doesn't matter whether you are righteous or not, because the desires does not discriminate. A person can follow his desire, and he is the most truthful and honest person, and so on, if he does not know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from him, from the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. Then he says, كان بعض العارفين, and the word عارفين got contaminated later, but it comes from the ma'rifah, those who know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. يتكلم على أصحابه. He was talking about, with regards to his friends or companions or so, على رأس جبل, when he was on top of a mountain. And he said, in whatever he said about them, لا ينال أحد مراده حتى ينفرد فردا بفرد. He said to them, no one would get whatever they desire or whatever they want till each one be alone with someone else. فانزعج واضطرب حتى رأى أصحابه أن الصخور قد تدكتكت وبقي على ذلك ساعات فلما أفاق فكأنه نشر من قبر. He's basically what he's mentioning here, that no one will have what he desires from someone till he is alone with him. He wanted to mention the issue of the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, which basically he refers to what he wants from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala till a person is sincerely and devoted to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. So حتى ينفرد فردا بفرد. That means the only way for you to attain any goodness is that if a person is turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. He refers to Allah by the word fard. This is basically, but if you have it more than one, you would never be able to attain it. It's one path, worshipping one Lord, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't get yourself distracted, basically, and this is what he meant by this. So sometimes you might sense some of these things as ulama, they say in the writings of Ibn Rajab, but of course to explain that in the light of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. One last point here, inshallah, and we'll continue it inshallah ta'ala tomorrow. He says that قول لا إله إلا الله, when a person says لا إله إلا الله تقتضي ألا يحب سواه فإن الإله هو الذي يطاع محبة وخوفا ورجاء. That now he's going to talk about the love of Allah, even though he mentioned it, but this is one act of worship which is the most important act of worship done by the heart, which is the love of Allah, and how to attain this love of Allah that is only to be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to be obeyed. Mahabbatan wa khawfan wa raja'an. Always these three acts of worship are always mentioned by the early generations of Islam, and that's why the ulama, they call it the pillars of the ibadah that is done by the heart. The perfect love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the fear of Allah, the hope for the rewards from Allah. وَمِن تَمَامِ مَحَبَّتِهِ. If you want to perfect your love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, مَحَبَّةُ مَا يُحِبُّ, that you love what Allah loves, وَكَرَاهَةُ مَا يَكْرَهُ, and you hate what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hates. And how would we know that? In the wahy from Allah, the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And again, this is with regards to the religious love, because you know it from the wahy, not what you have in your desire. So a person should not feel bad, for example, if he loves the taste of something that Allah forbade. He loves the taste of it. Does that mean that he is not among those who love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? No, but he hates it because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade it. And he would not drink it, he would not taste it. Why? Because Allah forbade it. So this is the religious love and hate, not the tab'a, not the innate or the natural love and hate. So فَمَنْ أَحَبَّ شَيْئًا مِمَّا يَكْرَهُ اللَّهُ أو كَرِهَ شَيْئًا مِمَّا يُحِبُّهُ اللَّهُ لَمْ يَكْمُلْ تَوْحِيدُهُ وَلَا صِدْقُهُ فِي قَوْلِ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ. Whoever does not love what Allah loves and hate what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hates, his tawheed is not going to be complete and perfected, and his truthfulness in saying La ilaha illallah would not be there, and he would have from a shirk al-khafi, from the hidden shirk, according to how much he hates or how much he loves, opposite to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves and hates. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in Surah Muhammad, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمُ اتَّبَعُوا مَا أَسْخَطَ اللَّهَ وَكَرِهُ رِضْوَانَهُ فَأَحْبَطَ أَعْمَالَهُم. These believers, that is before, because they followed what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hate, and they hated the pleasure of Allah. So Allah rendered their deeds in vain. And it doesn't have to be that this is their intentions, but they hated the pleasure of Allah when they followed what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hates and displeased with. And as Mujahid said in the ayah, لا يشركون بي شيئا, they do not associate partners with me. He said, لا يحبون غيري, they don't love except me. The perfect love which is not to be made shirk with. The love of the ta'zeem, the love of exalting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that makes the person always love what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the owner of all things. We will stop here inshallah ta'ala, and we continue with the subject, and he'll talk about the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this part, and then the sweetness of al-Iman. So I hope it's clear, and again this is the foundation and the core of our deen, to understand La ilaha illallah and to establish it. And once this is clear, and everything falls in place in an easy way, and we get to understand many things by the will of Allah. Otherwise, there's so much again as chaos and differences, and people are saying things and opposite to them saying something else. And many of it is because really the core of the religion and understanding the deen of Islam and understanding the meaning of La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, it's not well established, that causes people to fall into these types of deviations and differences among themselves. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us, inshallah. Keep us steadfast upon the deen of Allah.